The night air in East Harlem carried the scent of coal smoke and rain when Francesco Castilla first opened his eyes to the world. It was 1891, and the streets of New York were alive with the sound of survival. The neighborhood throbbed with shouting vendors, the creak of wagons, and the wailing of babies born into tenements stacked like tombstones. Frank Costello, as he would one day be called, came from nothing but grit and shadows. His parents had left a small town in Italy chasing the promise of America, only to find themselves in a place that devoured the weak and rewarded only the cunning. From the beginning, Frank understood the rules. He was quiet, observant, never the loudest boy on the block, but always the one who watched, learned, and remembered. When the other kids stole fruit from the pushcarts and ran, Frank noticed how the grocer's eyes followed one child, not another. He saw how timing mattered more than strength, how a smile could be a weapon, and how respect could get you farther than fear. These lessons would shape him more than school ever could. In those early years, East Harlem was a battleground of poverty and ambition. Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangs carved the city into invisible borders. Violence was currency, and loyalty was gold. The young Frank was not drawn to violence like so many others. He preferred the art of persuasion. But in a world where fists often spoke louder than words, he learned quickly how to balance both. His older brother, Edward, had already started to mingle with the local street toughs. Frank followed him, not because he loved the danger, but because he understood that power, any kind, was the only way out of the gutter. He was just a teenager when he got his first taste of the underworld. Small-time rackets, numbers running, a bit of petty theft here and there. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make headlines. But even then, Frank carried himself differently. He wore clean clothes when others didn't care. He spoke with calm certainty while others barked and bluffed. He didn't curse much, didn't brag, and rarely raised his voice. People remembered that. In a world of hotheads and show-offs, he was ice. Prohibition was the turning point for many young men in New York, and Frank was no exception. When alcohol went underground, opportunity flooded the streets. The men who could organize, plan, and negotiate suddenly became kings. It wasn't about who could swing a bat. It was about who could move a shipment without getting caught. Frank saw this new economy for what it was, a system waiting for someone smart enough to run it like a business. He had already learned to navigate between the Irish gangs uptown and the Italian outfits downtown, using diplomacy where others used guns. He was the bridge, fluent in both cultures, trusted by neither at first, but eventually respected by all. But before the bootlegging days, there was still the boy from Harlem, the son of immigrants trying to stay afloat. His parents wanted better for him. His father worked hard, barely earning enough to keep food on the table, but Frank's world was bigger than the cramped apartment they called home. He could feel the pulse of New York, its promise and its danger, thrumming beneath the cobblestones. Every night when the city lights flickered on and the elevated trains screamed past the rooftops, he would stare out the window and imagine what it felt like to control it all. The 1910s were years of change. Frank began to shed the rough edges of street life, trading brawls for business meetings in dimly lit bars. He studied men, how they talked, how they carried themselves, how they closed deals without ever pulling a trigger. His greatest education came not from books but from people. He learned that every man had a price, that kindness could be a transaction, and that sometimes silence was the loudest statement in the room. By the time he was in his 20s, he had reinvented himself. The rough, scrappy kid from East Harlem was now Frank Costello, a name that rolled off the tongue like it belonged in a boardroom rather than a police blotter. He dressed sharply, spoke clearly, and carried himself like someone who already belonged to a higher class of men. In truth, he was still running with criminals, but he didn't look the part. And that, more than anything, made him dangerous. There was a story that floated around the neighborhood even years later. One night during a heated argument over territory, a rival pulled a gun on Frank. The bar went dead silent. Most men would have frozen or reached for their own weapon. But not Frank. He simply stared at the man and said, "If you pull that trigger, you'll have to explain to a dozen people why business just stopped." The man hesitated. That pause was all Frank needed. The tension broke, the gun lowered, and the meeting ended with a handshake instead of blood. It was the first sign of what would make him legendary, the ability to turn war into negotiation, chaos into control. His reputation grew in quiet corners. He wasn't the kind of gangster who sought headlines. He preferred the shadows behind the spotlight, where real power lived. While others like Lucky Luciano or Dutch Schultz made the front pages with shootouts and headlines, Costello built networks. He invested in politicians, judges, and businessmen long before it became fashionable among mobsters. But this phase was still years ahead. Back then, he was just learning the first steps of that dance. In the tenements of East Harlem, everyone knew somebody who didn't make it past 25. But Frank was different. He survived because he adapted. He understood that brute force could win a fight, but intellect won wars. He avoided unnecessary enemies, paid his debts on time, and treated his crew like partners rather than pawns. These simple rules, learned in the alleys of New York, became the foundation of an empire that would one day reach into the highest levels of American society. Even as a young man, he had a strange sense of balance. He could be ruthless when cornered, yet polite to the same man he'd outsmarted hours earlier. He didn't enjoy violence but understood its purpose. To him, crime was not rebellion. It was business, just another form of negotiation in a world built on unfair deals. That belief would define him for decades. Sometimes, in his rare moments of reflection, Frank thought back to his father's tired eyes, to the way his mother prayed over every meal. They wanted him to be a good man, but Frank had realized something different. In a world run by crooks in suits and liars in government offices, being a good man wasn't always an option. So he decided to become something else, someone who could live in both worlds. A gentleman among thieves and a thief among gentlemen. The boy who once stood in the shadows of East Harlem now understood what it meant to command them. Every move he made, every word he spoke, was a step toward something larger. He wasn't chasing fame or vengeance. He was chasing control. Control over his destiny, over his business, over the chaos that had defined the streets of his youth. In those narrow alleyways and smoky bars, Frank Costello's transformation began, not with a gunshot, but with a decision. He chose to rise not by breaking the system, but by learning to master it. And while the other young men of Harlem played at being gangsters, Frank was already becoming something much more dangerous, a gentleman of the underworld in the making. The 1920s hit New York City like a fever dream. Jazz poured out of speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors. Liquor flowed in defiance of the law, and every alley hummed with the rhythm of opportunity and danger. For men like Frank Costello, this was not chaos. It was a gold rush. The 18th Amendment had outlawed alcohol, but it had also created a new kind of economy, one built on guts, secrecy, and organization. And Frank, with his cool head and sharp instincts, was built for it. He started small, working with neighborhood crews that smuggled whiskey from Canada and gin from the Caribbean. While other bootleggers were busy waving pistols and threatening bartenders, Frank focused on logistics. He learned how to manage routes, cut deals with corrupt dock workers, and quietly make deliveries without catching police attention. Every transaction was clean, every shipment accounted for. He didn't drink much himself, but he knew that alcohol was power, the kind that could buy friends in high places. By the mid-1920s, his name had started to echo beyond East Harlem. He had joined forces with some of the city's most ambitious young men. Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and others who saw crime not as thuggery, but as enterprise. Together they envisioned something bigger than turf wars and alley fights. They saw the underworld as a corporation, one that needed structure, diplomacy, and vision. Costello fit perfectly into that plan. He wasn't the muscle, and he didn't need to be. He was the man who could walk into a politician's office and walk out with a handshake and a favor. His charm was his weapon. He could disarm even the most suspicious man with a few calm words. In an age where most gangsters looked like gangsters, Frank looked like a banker. He wore tailored suits, polished shoes, and a smile that could pass for sincerity. He learned early that presentation was half the battle. If you looked like you belonged in the room, people stopped asking why you were there. Luciano saw in him a rare quality: balance. Frank could mediate disputes between rival gangs without losing his temper or his edge. When tensions rose between the old Sicilian bosses and the younger generation of mobsters who wanted to modernize, Frank was the bridge. He spoke their language, both literally and culturally. To the traditionalists, he offered respect and understanding. To the young bloods, he offered progress and practicality. Without ever raising his voice, he became indispensable. Their partnership took shape in the thick of the bootlegging boom. Luciano provided the vision, Genovese the muscle, and Costello the connections. They began to weave a network that reached far beyond the streets, into City Hall, the police department, and even the courts. Frank handled the delicate work of bribing officials and keeping the wheels of corruption well-oiled. He didn't see it as dirty. He saw it as necessary. Money, he once said, can buy anything if you know how to spend it quietly. Soon, Costello was managing vast sums of cash from gambling operations, speakeasies, and distribution deals. But unlike his flashier peers, he didn't flaunt it. He preferred fine cigars over champagne, subtle influence over loud displays of wealth. He understood that visibility was dangerous. The more you were seen, the easier you were to bring down. So he built his empire in whispers, behind curtains, through middlemen, always 2 steps removed from the mess. His reputation grew not from violence, but from efficiency. People started calling him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The title fit. He wasn't the kind of man who kicked down doors. He was the one who decided which doors should stay open. Even rival gangs learned to respect his diplomacy. If you had a problem and didn't want a war, you went to Costello. He had a knack for making everyone feel like they were winning, even when he had already claimed the prize. But with power came danger. As Luciano's syndicate grew, so did its enemies. Dutch Schultz, a volatile and arrogant figure in the New York underworld, saw Costello's calm demeanor as weakness. Schultz believed fear was the only true form of control. Frank believed fear was bad for business. The 2 men clashed more than once, though Frank rarely took it personally. He understood that men like Schultz burned out fast. Violence drew attention, and attention brought the law. Frank's method was slower, quieter, but it endured. He once told a close associate, "We're not running a circus, we're running a business. The less noise we make, the longer we last." It was a philosophy that guided every decision he made. While shootouts filled the newspapers, Costello's operations continued to grow in the background, untouched and unbothered. The end of Prohibition in 1933 could have been the end for many bootleggers. But for Frank, it was just another evolution. He had already begun shifting his interests toward gambling and legitimate business ventures. Slot machines became his new empire, silent earners that needed no smuggling, no violence, just placement and maintenance. He struck deals across the country, installing machines in bars, restaurants, and clubs. Each one was a steady stream of cash, and each one expanded his influence. But none of it would have been possible without his greatest asset, his ability to build alliances. Frank knew that the mob couldn't survive without cooperation. The old days of street-by-street domination were over. Luciano's dream of a commission, a governing body of organized crime families, became reality in 1931, and behind the scenes Costello helped shape its foundation. He was the voice of reason in a room full of egos. When tempers flared, he was the calm hand that kept the table from flipping over. Through these years, his relationship with Luciano deepened into something close to brotherhood. They shared the same belief, that crime could be civilized, organized, and sustainable. But while Lucky relished the power, Frank cherished the stability. He didn't want to be the king. He wanted to be the man who advised the king. Power, he knew, was safer when it wasn't flashy. Yet even in his calm ascent, there were cracks forming beneath the surface. Some within the mob whispered that Costello's preference for diplomacy made him soft. Others, particularly Genovese, grew jealous of his influence. Frank brushed it off. He had seen too many men destroy themselves trying to prove they were tough. He wasn't interested in proving anything. He was interested in staying alive and staying in control. As the 1930s moved forward, Frank began to mingle more openly with politicians. He donated quietly to campaigns, funded civic projects, and even gave interviews that painted him as a reformed businessman. The lines between legitimate and illegitimate began to blur, and that was exactly how he wanted it. While others built empires of fear, Frank built an empire of relationships. One night, at a quiet bar in Midtown, a local politician raised a glass to him and said, "You know, Frank, you're the kind of man who makes people forget what side of the law you're on." Frank smiled softly and replied, "That's the point, my friend." By the end of the decade, the immigrant boy from East Harlem had become one of the most influential figures in American organized crime. but you wouldn't find him on most wanted lists or in front-page headlines. He existed in that rare gray space between worlds, the respectable and the criminal, the polite and the dangerous. Every empire has its foundation, and for Frank Costello, that foundation was built not on violence, but on understanding. He understood people, their greed, their fears, their desires. He could predict a man's next move before he made it, and that made him invaluable. When the law cracked down on his peers, when rivals turned on each other, Frank kept moving forward. Calm, steady, unshaken. The streets of New York were changing, but the man who had once walked them as a poor immigrant's son was now pulling strings behind the scenes of politics, gambling, and power itself. He had risen from the smoke of prohibition not as a gangster, but as something far more sophisticated, a statesman of the underworld. And though he wore fine suits and spoke in measured tones, there was steel beneath the silk. Frank Costello had learned how to climb to the top of the criminal world without ever firing a shot. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the view became. The 1940s dawned over New York with a new rhythm. The roaring jazz of the previous decade gave way to wartime rationing and whispers of change. For Frank Costello, it was a decade of quiet dominance. While others sought fame or revenge, he pursued something far more elusive: legitimacy. The empire he had built during Prohibition had matured into a network of influence that reached deep into the city's institutions. He didn't just control men, he controlled decisions. And in a city where every favor could ripple upward to the highest office, that kind of control was priceless. Frank had learned long ago that power didn't have to shout. It could whisper. It could shake hands in the daylight while making deals in the dark. His gambling operations, especially the slot machine business, were thriving. Thousands of machines hummed in bars and cafes from New York to New Orleans, each one feeding his growing fortune. But money was only half the story. What truly set him apart was his relationship with the world above the streets. Judges, mayors, police captains, all found themselves in quiet debt to the man they called the Prime Minister. He would stroll through the Waldorf Astoria lobby like a visiting dignitary, nodding politely to businessmen and politicians who knew exactly who he was but never dared to say it aloud. His voice carried no threat, his tone no urgency. He was calm, deliberate, almost regal. And yet, beneath that calm exterior was the sharp mind of a man who knew how fragile power could be. Luciano's deportation in 1946 changed the balance of everything. Lucky had been Frank's closest ally, the visionary who'd seen crime as an organization, not a brawl. With him gone, the underworld turned its eyes toward Costello. He was now the de facto head of the Luciano family, though he never wanted to be called boss. Titles were dangerous. Titles made you a target. Frank preferred influence without ceremony, control without a crown. He once said to an associate, "You can rule more with respect than with fear, but it takes twice the patience." Patience became his greatest weapon. As Genovese plotted in the shadows, waiting for his moment to return from exile and reclaim the throne, Costello kept the family running smoothly. He maintained peace with other crime families through diplomacy, dividing profits fairly, avoiding bloodshed. In an era when gangland violence could bring the FBI crashing down, his restraint kept the syndicate alive. But outside forces were shifting. The country was changing. The post-war boom filled America with optimism, and the government began to take a harder stance against organized crime. Senator Estes Kefauver launched a crusade to expose the mafia, holding televised hearings that brought mob figures into living rooms across the nation. For the first time, the public could see their faces, their expressions, their defiance. It was the birth of America's fascination with gangsters and the death of their anonymity. When Frank Costello was called to testify in 1951, the world finally saw the man behind the myth. Millions watched as he sat before the committee, his hands clasped, his voice low but steady. He refused to incriminate himself, but his composure fascinated the audience. Unlike the brash mobsters who came before him, Frank didn't bluster or threaten. He spoke like a man inconvenienced by foolish questions. When the camera zoomed in on his trembling hands, he famously asked to have them turned off, saying, "I don't like my face being shown." It was pure irony. The man who had spent his life staying invisible was now a national spectacle. The hearings were both a triumph and a curse. On one hand, they elevated him to legendary status. the polite gangster, the gentleman who defied Congress with class. On the other, they painted a target on his back. The public saw sophistication. His rivals saw vulnerability. Genovese, ever the opportunist, began to move quietly against him. He whispered to allies that Frank was too soft, too old, too comfortable with politicians. The streets didn't need a diplomat, Genovese claimed. They needed a real boss. Frank ignored the noise. He'd heard worse, but deep down he knew the tides were turning. The underworld was changing, more violent, less patient. Men like him were relics of a different age. Still, he wasn't about to step down without dignity. His empire was running smoothly, his investments secure. He spent more time in the company of high society now, lawyers, real estate developers, even a few senators. To them, he was a charming enigma, a man who could talk about world affairs over scotch while never mentioning where his money came from. He had perfected the art of walking between worlds. In one night, he could dine with a judge and later settle a dispute between rival crews in a smoke-filled basement. He was the bridge, the balance point between chaos and order. But bridges by nature are always under pressure. By the mid-1950s, Genovese had returned to New York and was quietly consolidating power. He'd never forgiven Frank for taking over the family while he was gone. Jealousy burned in him like a fever, and he began plotting Frank's removal, not through diplomacy but through blood. Costello, ever the realist, saw the signs, the late-night whispers, the sudden disappearances, the way once loyal men started avoiding his calls. Still, he moved with his usual calm. He had survived worse storms. His faith was not in loyalty but in reason, and that perhaps was his one miscalculation. Because Genovese was not a man of reason. On a mild evening in 1957, Frank Costello returned to his Central Park apartment building after dinner. As he stepped into the lobby, a man approached from behind. There was a flash, a deafening crack, and a bullet grazed the side of his head. Frank stumbled forward, blood dripping down his temple, the world spinning in slow motion. The shooter, Vincent the Chin Gigante, one of Genovese's men, fled into the night. The newspapers called it a miracle. The bullet had missed by inches, carving a path through his scalp instead of his skull. When the police arrived, Frank was sitting upright, calm as ever. The doorman later said he muttered only one phrase before collapsing. The hell with it. The attack sent shockwaves through the underworld. It wasn't just an assassination attempt, it was a declaration of war. But Costello, true to his nature, refused to retaliate. He knew a war would destroy everything he had built. Instead, he made a decision that stunned everyone. He stepped down. Quietly, without ceremony, he withdrew from the life that had defined him. Genovese took control of the family, but the cost of that victory would come later. For now, the gentleman had left the stage. In the days following the shooting, Frank recovered in near silence. He spent hours staring out the window of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker like distant fires. He'd once ruled these streets without ever being seen, and now he watched them as an outsider. Perhaps he knew even then that his time had passed. The world had become louder, more brutal, less suited for men of patience and principle, even if those principles were carved from corruption. Reporters hounded him for interviews, but he rarely spoke. When he did, his words carried the same calm gravity as always. "A man gets tired," he said once. "There comes a point when you just want peace." It was an odd sentiment from a man who had lived his entire life balancing on the edge of power, but it was honest. The bullet hadn't killed him, but it had reminded him that no amount of influence could make you immortal. Frank Costello's empire did not crumble overnight. His investments, political connections, and quiet networks continued to yield profit long after he stepped away. But his absence left a void, one that men like Genovese filled with violence and paranoia. The age of the gentleman gangster was over. For Frank, it was enough to fade away with dignity. He still entertained friends, hosted small gatherings, and offered advice to younger men who came seeking wisdom. But he never returned to the throne. He didn't need to. He had proven that power could exist without shouting, that respect could be more enduring than fear. And though he would never admit it aloud, part of him took quiet pride in having outlasted almost everyone who tried to kill him. As the years passed, his legend grew. To the law, he was a criminal mastermind. To his peers, he was a statesman. And to history, he became something in between. A paradox, a man who thrived in darkness but carried himself with light. The empire he built was still standing, even if he no longer ruled it. And somewhere deep down, Frank Costello must have known that was his greatest victory. The years after the shooting felt quieter, almost hollow, yet in that silence Frank Costello found something he hadn't felt in decades: clarity. The near-death experience had stripped away the illusion of invincibility that had once wrapped around him like armor. The city outside his window no longer belonged to him, but it still pulsed with the same restless energy he had once mastered. Sometimes, late at night, he would listen to the hum of traffic from his high-rise apartment and think about how strange it was that life kept moving even after you stepped away from it. For the first time in his adult life, Frank lived without an agenda. He still received visitors, politicians, old associates, young hustlers hoping for advice, but he no longer gave orders or made deals. The men who came to see him would leave, saying they had spoken to a legend, though Frank always waved away such talk. Legends don't grow old, he would mutter with a half-smile. They just fade. He'd been fading for years, and he knew it. Yet, there was dignity in the fade. The underworld he'd left behind had become unrecognizable. Violence ruled now, not diplomacy. The new generation of gangsters didn't care for the rules that had once kept the peace. They shot first and asked questions never. The commission, once the great experiment of order within crime, had turned into a battlefield of egos. Where he had once seen strategy and stability, now there was greed and chaos. Frank read about the arrests, the betrayals, the endless wars between families, and felt nothing but disappointment. He had spent years trying to prove that crime could be civilized, but civilization was never built to last in a world without patience. He kept his days simple. Mornings began with coffee, the newspaper, and a slow walk around the block if his health allowed it. People still recognized him sometimes, though fewer each year. Some would whisper, others would nod respectfully. The old-timers remembered. The young ones only knew the myth. To them, Frank Costello was a name from another era, part of the golden age of gangsters, when men in suits ran empires from smoky rooms instead of shooting each other in the streets. There were moments when he almost missed it, the thrill of strategy, the satisfaction of control. But then he would remember the paranoia, the sleepless nights, the constant balancing act between trust and betrayal. Peace, he realized, had its own kind of power. It wasn't loud or intoxicating, but it was steady. For a man who had spent his life juggling chaos, steadiness was a kind of redemption. In the mid-1960s, law enforcement still hadn't forgotten him. The FBI kept tabs, watching from a distance, half expecting the old fox to re-emerge. But Frank was done. He gave them nothing but silence. Once in a while, an ambitious reporter would knock on his door, hoping to coax a confession or headline. Frank would listen politely, maybe pour them a drink, then send them away with a shrug, and a line that summed up his philosophy. I never talked when it mattered. Why start now? He never wrote a book, never sold his story, never sought attention. He'd spent his life operating in the gray space between the law and the lawless, and that gray was where he intended to stay. His restraint, more than anything, defined his final years. Where others tried to rewrite their histories, Frank seemed content to let his speak for itself. But memories had a way of sneaking up on him. Sometimes, sitting alone in the evening light, he would find himself replaying moments from long ago, the smell of bootleg whiskey in the warehouses, the laughter of Luciano echoing across a bar table, the echo of the Senate chamber during his testimony. Every image felt like a painting in a museum, distant, frozen, untouchable. He wasn't sentimental by nature, but age softened the sharp edges. He could look back now without flinching. He thought often about Lucky. Their bond had been built on mutual respect, ambition, and shared vision. They had changed the face of organized crime together, made it smarter, less primitive. But they had also invited the kind of attention that could never be undone. When Luciano was deported, it felt like a part of the original dream had left with him. Frank sometimes wondered what would have happened if Lucky had stayed, if diplomacy had survived a little longer before violence took over again. Then there were the old wounds, names like Genovese and Gigante that still lingered in the back of his mind. He bore them no open hatred, Time had dulled even that. Genovese had eventually gotten what was coming to him, dying in prison, isolated and bitter. Costello didn't celebrate it, but he recognized the symmetry. The man who had taken power by the gun had lost it behind bars, while the man who'd stepped aside lived long enough to see the world move on without him. That, in its own way, was victory. He once told a close friend, "It's funny, isn't it? We spend our whole lives trying to climb the ladder, and by the time we reach the top, we're too tired to look down." He wasn't bitter, just honest. Life had given him everything he'd asked for, and then it had taken it all back. But what remained was something he'd never expected: peace in anonymity. By the 1970s, Frank had become a ghost of his former self. His health declined slowly, but his mind remained sharp. He still followed the news, still played cards with old associates, still moved with quiet grace even as his steps grew slower. The men who visited him noticed how his once commanding presence had mellowed into something almost paternal. He would pour drinks, listen to their stories, and offer the same advice every time: don't stay in too long. The house always wins. Despite his distance from active life, whispers about him persisted. Some said he still pulled strings from the shadows. Others claimed he had secret holdings across the country. Frank never confirmed nor denied. The mystery suited him. To him, reputation was currency, and even in retirement, his was still valuable. The changing city fascinated him. The skyscrapers, the shifting neighborhoods, the new faces replacing the old. He would sometimes drive through East Harlem, unrecognizable from the streets of his youth. The tenements were gone, the pushcarts replaced by storefronts. Yet somewhere beneath the pavement, he could still feel the ghost of the boy he once was, the immigrant kid with nothing but hunger and ambition. Everything he had built, everything he had lost, had started right there. There were quiet visits from priests too, men who came not to judge but to talk. Frank listened politely when they spoke of redemption, but he never confessed anything. He had his own sense of morality, shaped by decades of compromise and necessity. "I did what I had to do," he told one, "and I tried not to hurt more people than the world already did." It wasn't absolution, but it was truth. He lived long enough to see America romanticize men like him. Movies, books, television, all painting gangsters as tragic heroes. It amused him. He'd chuckle at the screen, watching actors play men like Luciano or himself with brooding gravitas. "They make us look too clean," he once said. "We were businessmen, sure, but business is never clean." As the years rolled on, his world grew smaller. Friends died, old allies vanished, and the phone rang less often. But he didn't fear loneliness. In a strange way, solitude was the first honest thing he'd ever known. The noise was gone, the endless deals, the negotiations, the double crosses. All that remained was the sound of his own breath and the quiet satisfaction of having survived. Frank Costello lived until 1973. He was 82 years old when his heart finally gave out in his sleep. No bullets, no headlines, no final reckoning, just silence. It was the kind of ending he'd always preferred. The newspapers ran brief obituaries, describing him as a reputed underworld figure and a gentleman gangster. Those who knew him better understood the truth. He had been the last of a dying breed. After his death, people debated his legacy. Some called him a criminal genius, others a corrupt manipulator, still others a visionary who had given the mafia its shape and structure. But the man himself had always been more complicated than that. He was proof that power didn't always wear brass knuckles. Sometimes it wore cufflinks and a calm smile. The world kept spinning after he was gone, faster and louder than ever. But somewhere in the echo of New York's sleepless nights, you could still feel the faint trace of the man who had once ruled it from the shadows, not with fear, but with understanding. Frank Costello's empire had fallen, his era had ended, but his influence lingered like the smoke of a fine cigar, subtle, enduring, impossible to forget. When Frank Costello looked back at his life, he often wondered where the line between respectability and corruption truly lay. By the end of his days, that line had blurred beyond recognition, yet he had spent a lifetime trying to stay balanced upon it. He wasn't like the others. No loud suits, no garish cars, no drunken rampages in speakeasies or cigar-chomping boasts in dim back rooms. Costello prided himself on being calm, measured, a man who preferred diplomacy over violence. But even the most refined mobster couldn't escape the inevitable tides of change. The 1950s brought a new era to America. The golden days of prohibition were long gone, and so were many of the old gangsters who had built empires on bootleg whiskey and bribed politicians. Television was the new king of influence, and for the first time, the underworld could no longer hide in the shadows. Frank Costello had become something of a ghost, powerful but quiet, lurking behind the curtain of politics and legitimate businesses. He had been the bridge between mobsters and mayors, crooks and congressmen. But every bridge, no matter how sturdy, eventually begins to crack. The cracks started to show in 1951. The U.S. Senate's Kefauver Committee was investigating organized crime, and Costello's name came up again and again. He had managed to stay clean on paper for decades, but whispers of his power reached the highest offices. When he was subpoenaed to testify before the committee, Costello did what he always did. He played the gentleman. He walked into the hearings wearing a conservative suit, speaking in measured tones, trying to project the image of a misunderstood businessman. But television cameras were rolling, and the nation was watching. For the first time, the mysterious Frank Costello was beamed into living rooms across America. He didn't say much. He was too smart for that. But what people saw mattered more than what they heard. When he refused to show his face to the camera, only allowing his hands to be filmed, it became one of the most iconic images in American history. Those hands, steady, elegant, tapping on the table, became a symbol of hidden power. Yet they also made him a target. The mystique that had once protected him now painted him as the puppet master behind the corruption in politics. The hearing ended with no conviction, but the damage was done. The man who had built his reputation on quiet influence was now a public villain. Costello returned to his world with a grim realization. The game had changed. The new generation of mobsters didn't share his restraint or sense of order. Men like Vito Genovese had been waiting for their chance, men who respected power only when it came from fear. Genovese had once been Costello's ally, even his protege. But envy and ambition ran deeper than loyalty in the mafia. Genovese wanted the throne, and Costello stood in his way. It began with whispers, then alliances shifting behind closed doors. Genovese moved carefully, gathering soldiers and corrupt cops, promising them a future under his rule. He watched as Costello's influence waned, as politicians distanced themselves from the tainted figure exposed on national television. Costello could feel the noose tightening, though he never showed it. For a man who had survived decades in the underworld, pride was the last armor he had left. One spring evening in 1957, Costello walked into the lobby of his Manhattan apartment building, the Majestic on Central Park West. He had just returned from dinner with friends, his mind still sharp despite the years. As he turned toward the elevator, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a man with cold eyes and a steady hand. The silence shattered with a gunshot. The bullet grazed the side of Costello's head, tearing through his hat and drawing blood, but by some miracle, it didn't kill him. The shooter fled into the night, leaving behind a shaken but still breathing Costello. The man behind the attempt was Vincent the Chin Gigante, acting on Genovese's orders. The message was clear: step down or die. Lying in the hospital, his head bandaged and his dignity bruised, Costello faced the most difficult decision of his life. He had spent decades avoiding violence, maintaining peace among the 5 families, and ensuring business ran smoothly without unnecessary bloodshed. But now he saw what his restraint had cost him. The new generation wanted blood, not balance. When he was released, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions, flashing cameras. Costello raised his hand and said quietly, "I forgive him." It was a statement that sounded noble, almost saintly, but those who knew him understood what it really meant. He was tired. He was done. The empire he had built from smoke and silence had finally crumbled under the weight of greed and time. He retired from active operations, ceding control to Genovese. It wasn't a surrender in the traditional sense. It was survival. Costello knew that living quietly was better than dying loudly. The underworld he had shaped no longer resembled the one he loved. The honor codes, the diplomacy, the subtlety, it had all been replaced with paranoia and brutality. From his elegant apartment overlooking Central Park, Costello watched the city he had once ruled from the shadows. He saw the world changing, new money, new faces, new crimes. The mafia was entering a new age, one that no longer had room for gentlemen. Years passed. Genovese's reign turned chaotic, and he eventually found himself in prison. Costello, meanwhile, managed to live comfortably, untouched, his wealth intact. He spent his days in leisure, enjoying the finer things that had always appealed to him: golf, fine whiskey, and conversations with old friends who still respected the code. Occasionally, he was spotted dining in upscale restaurants, impeccably dressed, still carrying himself with that same quiet confidence. But there was something haunted in his eyes, something that knew the world had moved on without him. He once told a journalist, "I don't want to be remembered as a gangster. I just want to be left alone." But history had other plans. Costello became a legend precisely because he blurred the line between crime and class. He wasn't the trigger-happy thug or the flashy mob boss. He was the man who talked to senators, who shaped policy, who understood that power didn't always need to roar. Sometimes it only needed to whisper. As he aged, his reflections grew softer, more philosophical. He often mused about the difference between respect and fear. Fear, he would say, is a leash. Respect, now that's freedom. It was that belief that had guided him through his rise, and perhaps even saved him during his fall. When he finally passed away in 1973, the newspapers described him as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, a fitting title for a man who ruled not through bullets, but through influence. Yet, behind that polished title lay the story of an immigrant boy who had simply learned to survive in a brutal world by outthinking everyone else. Costello's life was a lesson in duality: crime and civility, corruption and class, violence and diplomacy. He proved that the mafia wasn't always about gunfire in the streets. Sometimes it was about a handshake in a smoky backroom that changed the course of politics. In the end, Frank Costello left behind more than just stories. He left behind a blueprint for a kind of power that couldn't be easily seen or measured. The world remembered the killers, the outlaws, the loud men who burned bright and died young. But Costello endured, not because he was the toughest, but because he understood that true control came from restraint. He died a free man, surrounded by luxury, respected by some, feared by others, and perhaps envied by all. And as the years passed, the myth of Frank Costello continued to grow. To some, he was the gentleman gangster, the last of a dying breed. To others, he was proof that corruption could wear a tailored suit and speak softly. But to those who knew the truth, he was simply a man who had walked the fine line between darkness and light, and managed, against all odds, to never fall completely into either. That was his legacy, a whisper in the history of crime, a reminder that even in the underworld, there once lived a man who believed in civility amidst chaos. And while the world moved on to louder villains and flashier crimes, the memory of Frank Costello remained, quiet, refined, unshakable. The gentleman of the underworld had taken his final bow, leaving behind not just a story, but a lesson. Power without grace is fleeting, but grace, even in darkness, can make a man immortal.